Again, the most common logical fallacies. We're on point number 7, which is known as the red herring. So I went and looked up to find out more about the red herring, the literal red herring, not the logical fallacy red herring, but I'll explain the logical fallacy in 1 second. But a herring is, according to ChatGPT, a small oily fish found in the Atlantic and Pacific oceans. It is known for being a key part of the diet in many coastal areas. They're often eaten smoked, pickled, or salted, and they're a staple in traditional dishes like pickled herring or kippered herring. I'm not sure if I've ever eaten that before. Maybe I have. But the term red herring it comes from the practice of using smoked herring, because when it's smoked, the herring turns red and it throws dogs off of a scent. So basically, it's a metaphor for distraction in an argument, which leads right to my description of the red herring fallacy, which is introducing an irrelevant topic into a conversation in order to divert attention from the main issue. That is a red herring. I'll give you an example of this. I was having a conversation on Twitter Spaces, or X Spaces, many months ago, maybe about a year ago. And I was in a conversation with a random person who I do not know. I just responded to something that he had posted, or he responded to something that I had posted, something like that. He said, well, you should come into our space and debate on this subject. I said, fine, let's go debate on the subject. I show up to the debate, and the guy who I had been posting back and forth with, he was not even the one I was debating with. It was some other guy who I didn't even know who this guy was. And as soon as the conversation starts, he starts throwing out red herrings to change the subject from the main thing that we were talking about. So the conversation was, I said something along the lines of men should not be competing in women's sports. His immediate response to that was, what's the difference between gender and sex? He asked me to define the two terms. And I told him I'm not defining those two terms. And he goes on to say, well, since you can't define the terms, you are unqualified to talk about the topic. That is a red herring, because he's trying to change the subject and bring it into a space that has nothing to do with the main thing that I said. You don't need to be able to define gender and sex, or you don't have to define gender or sex in order to say that a man should not be competing in women's sports. But this is exactly what that guy did. That's an example of a red herring. Another example, whenever you hear people talking about politics in the United States, you may hear someone who probably considers themselves morally superior to say something like, why is anybody debating politics happening in the United States when the United States is out there bombing and causing people to die in all these other countries? That's a bigger issue. That's a red herring. You're trying to change people's focus from talking about the politics here in America about talking about something else that's happening. It's not that you're wrong or that you're lying to be wanting to pay attention to something else or wanting others to do so, but it is a red herring because that's not the topic at hand. So a red herring is a great tool that people can use to, again, distract or throw you off the scent of the topic that you are talking about, because maybe they're uncomfortable with going any deeper on that topic. So they use the red herring as a strategic tool to basically give themselves some relief, give themselves a little break from the heat that might be descending upon them. So red herring, again, is often used, as I said, when people don't want to discuss the topic at hand for myriad reasons, and they throw something else out there so they can see if they can change the subject or shift the battleground to terrain on which they are more comfortable. So, for example, when I said to this guy, hey, men shouldn't compete in women's sports, he tried to shift the ground to, well, let's get into the details of the definitions of what words mean, because that's where I guess he figured he has some expertise, and there he could be more high and mighty and what's the word? The word is escaping me. He could occupy. That's the word. He could occupy the moral or the intellectual high ground in the conversation if I had followed his red herring, but I didn't. And long story short, to that situation, when I didn't follow his red herrings, he tried this a couple times. They basically muted me from being able to talk, and I said, if you mute me again, I'm going to leave the space. And they muted me again, I left the space, and it was pretty much over. This whole thing lasted literally 3 minutes. But anyway, this red herring is one you got to be very careful with, because really smart people are good at using this, because again, they usually want to turn the conversation to something in which they are very knowledgeable so that they can basically dominate the conversation. So you're going to notice people who are really good with words, people who are usually highly educated people. When I say highly educated, what I mean is advanced degree holder type of individuals. Some of you who I'm describing right now, advanced degree holders who are really good with words, they tend to use red herrings all the time because they want to bring the conversation into a space in which they have the expertise, and they can dazzle you with words and thus talk circles around you so that they can dominate the conversation and feel as if, or appear as if, they have quote unquote won the conversation. And again, people of that ilk, do this all the time. I see them do it all the time. Look around the internet, you'll find them. They go on the internet just so they can do this because this is how they show themselves off. So, and people are literally trained to do this kind of stuff. Okay, so someone gets asked a question that they really don't want to answer. For example, let's say a politician. Politicians get trained for this. If you're asked a question that you really don't want to answer, politicians will use the red herring to change the subject and start talking about something else. So if you ask the Democratic candidate a question that they don't really want to answer, they'll respond by talking about, what you really should be asking is why my opponent, the Republican, is doing ABC. Notice that they didn't even answer the question. They just start talking about something else. And a good journalist or a good conversationalist or a good interviewer will not let them bullshit you around with that by using the red herring. They'll bring you back to the topic and make you address it, often to the detriment of the person who doesn't want to answer the question. So the difference with politicians is that the time is often limited when they're being interviewed. So if a politician uses a red herring enough times, they can soak up enough time in the conversation that eventually you have to move on because you're going to run out of time before the interview's over and you can't make them answer the question. Whereas to juxtapose that with, let's say, someone who is taking the stand in a court of law, you try to throw out a red herring when you're asked the direct question. There's no time limit on how long you're going to be on the stand. Once you really get on the stand, you're on the stand. So you have to answer those questions. So you can't use the red herring in that situation because you don't have the leverage. So this is the reason why sometimes people can get away with using the red herring even when it's obvious that they're doing it. So again, certain times you can't bring people back to the topic that they don't want to address because, again, your resources are limited, i.e. your time. You're going to run out of questions. So you look at a political debate, for example, when someone BS's and uses a red herring to not answer a question, the moderators can't always keep pressing them on that same point because they have 20 questions to answer. We're only on question number 3, and there's a certain amount of time we can take for each question, but we're going to run out of time if we take too much time on one question, even though you didn't get an answer to it. So this is how politicians are able to get away with this. And again, politicians understand this very well, and they are trained and they practice doing this just so they can dodge certain questions when they feel like it. And again, this is why politicians can get away with lying by omission, outright lying, or using propaganda or taking factual information and pulling it out of context to present you a quote unquote fact when it's actually a lie because they're not telling you all the facts. So if you're talking to an individual, however, you can catch them and call them on their bullshit and bring them back to the main point, maybe, depending on who you're talking to. Point number 8, today's topic, once again, is the common logical fallacies, most common logical fallacies you see and use and have used against you. Number 8 is the bandwagon fallacy. This is one you'll find a lot on social media. You also find it a lot amongst groups of people. You'll find it amongst teams. You'll find it amongst organizations. You will find it in middle school lunchrooms. You'll find it anywhere where people gather together. You will find a bandwagon fallacy, basically anywhere in life. Bandwagon fallacy is arguing that something must be true or good simply because it is popular or it has been widely accepted. You can also flip that around and say something must be terrible or bad simply because it is not popular or it has been widely rejected. Neither of those prove anything. Once people agreeing with something does not make it true, does not make it right, it does not make it accurate. At the same time, once people disagreeing with something does not make it bad, does not make it incorrect, and does not make it wrong. But many human beings, because we are wired as humans for social connection, we tend to comply with the bandwagon fallacy because we don't want to feel isolated and not part of the group. In other words, many people will agree with something that they generally would not agree with if they were by themselves. They will agree with it when they're amongst the group because they want to be part of the group, not because they actually think that it's true or because they've taken time to actually consider it. Humans just want to be connected to other humans. It is the rare individual who is willing to stand out and be separate from the masses of a group when the masses of the group are disagreeing with them or they are disagreeing with the masses. And they're willing to stand out and say, no, I disagree with the group. So if all 10 of you think this and I'm the one who thinks this, I'm completely okay with that. Most people are not okay with that. And people who are part of the 10 who agree, they will use the group dynamics against that one individual who's choosing to stand out and say, look, well, all of us think this and you think that. Don't you think that means something? Don't you think that means that you might possibly be wrong? And there are many people, hopefully some of you who are understanding this now as you're hearing me, who actually grow into adulthood believing that this is true. Look at all of us thinking this and you over there by yourself thinking that. That must mean that you're wrong. That must mean that you don't have the right information. That must mean that you're inaccurate. This is not true. So all of you need to be careful with this bandwagon fallacy, whether you are the one perpetuating it. And I know some of you have perpetuated this in your past. Maybe you have some of these thoughts in your mind right now, or you're the one who's having it used against you. Usually the one who is having it used against them is the disagreeable type, the person who is okay with standing apart from the group and saying, okay, group has one opinion, I have a different opinion, I'm willing to stand on that opinion, even though it means I am isolated and separated from the group, at least when it comes to this topic. So let's go back to the example of my friend who's taking his kids to the doctor. Who I told you I had a friend who took his kid to the doctor to get a bunch of shots, a bunch of jabs, that V word that I probably shouldn't say when we put my content on certain platforms. So at one point, he said, this is what he said to me in this conversation. Just to recap the conversation briefly, he was asking me, am I going to take my kid, because our kids are around the same age, am I going to take my kid to the doctor to get a bunch of shots the way he was taking his kid to the doctor to get a bunch of shots? I said I was not. We had a little bit of an exchange about it. And eventually he said something along the lines of the following. He said that everyone he knew who had a kid was taking their kid to the doctor to get shots the same way that he was taking his kid to the doctor to get shots. In other words, he was alluding to the fact that since a bunch of people were doing the same thing that he was about to do, it must be a smart and reasonable and logical thing to do because everybody he knows was doing the exact same thing. My response to that is LOL. Laugh out loud. All right, just because a bunch of other people are doing the same thing that you're about to do does not mean that you are smart, does not mean that you're reasonable, does not mean that what you're doing is the best thing that you should do. It actually could mean that you're a complete idiot because you're just following the crowd. Now, it might mean the crowd is very smart and you're following the crowd, and that's a smart thing to do. There are times in life when this makes sense. For example, most people do not run across the street when there's a red light and the traffic has a green light and there are cars coming. That's probably a dumb thing to do. So if you walk up to the corner, you see a bunch of people standing there watching the cars go by because the cars have a green light and the pedestrians have a red light, that is a time when it makes sense to follow the crowd. But there are other times when it doesn't make sense to follow the crowd. So this is where wisdom comes in, and you must use your own personal judgment. So do not take what I'm telling you here to mean that you should always go against the group because the group is always wrong. The group is not always wrong. There are certain things in which it's smart to follow the group. All right. Again, nobody's jumping out into the street to try to dodge cars in traffic. That's probably a smart thing you should do. But if everybody's taking themselves to the doctor or taking their kids to the doctor to get a bunch of shots and you don't agree or you have questions, you should either not do it or ask your questions and not just blindly comply like most people do. So the reason why I bring this up is because I'll tell you about that. I'll get to that in one moment. But this bandwagon fallacy, again, it gets used by grown adults. And this friend who I mentioned is nearly 50 years of age using this bandwagon fallacy in the same way that 10-year-olds use the bandwagon fallacy. Anything that's popular, widely accepted, or on the flip side, unpopular and widely denounced, people tend to follow the crowd because human beings are social creatures. Most people, remember, do not think, do not read, and are both mentally and physically lazy. What that means is most people will not do the mental work to figure out why is everyone thinking this way, so I can decide if I'm going to go along with them or I'm going to go against them. Most people don't do that work. They simply take the shortcut of looking at what everybody else is doing and they just do it. Earl Nightingale talked about this in his famous audio recording called The Strangest Secret. If you're not familiar with it, go look it up on YouTube or Spotify and you can listen to it for free. It's 36 minutes long. It's called The Strangest Secret. One of the things that Earl Nightingale says in there is the reason why many men come up short in life, and he was referring to men because at the time that he recorded this back in the either 50s or the 60s, most of the people who worked, most of the workforce were men. So he said the reason why many men fail in life because many men simply comply. They show up somewhere, they look around what everyone else is doing, they just follow the crowd. And he said, on the contrary, if you actually want to be wildly successful, you should show up somewhere, look at what everyone else is doing, and do the opposite of the crowd because that's where the opportunity is. It's the same thing that I'm telling you. Most people follow everybody else without thinking. Even when they do think, when they realize the conclusion that they've come to will put them against the crowd, they still won't do what they came to a conclusion to do because they don't want to deal with the emotional isolation of being separate from the group. This is why many people comply. Not because everybody's just a blind robot. A bunch of people are blind robots, but many people are smart enough to know what the crowd is doing is wrong, but they go along with it anyway because you don't want to be isolated. You don't want to be by yourself. You have to understand this bandwagon fallacy. All right, you have to understand that most people do not change much in life once they reach adulthood. They just continue following and continue complying because that's what they've been doing so far. And they just do what everybody else is doing, and that keeps them being pretty much the same. Now, this is the reason why I can confidently assert that most people do not change in life. Because changing means doing something different than what everybody else is doing. Most people ain't willing to do that. So again, if you haven't seen one of your high school classmates in a few decades, if you're 40 years old, you haven't seen your high school classmates since graduation, do not worry. Let me help you out. All right, if you missed the reunion, don't worry. If you're not going to go to the reunion, don't worry. Let me tell you something. All right, they just got older and they got uglier. Nothing else has changed. All right, they're the same person they were last time you saw them. Nothing else changed. So unless you want to see a bunch of old, ugly people who used to be young and a little bit more attractive, don't go to your high school reunion. All right, that's tongue in cheek, but not really. Moving on to point number 9. Today's topic, once again, is common logical fallacies that you will either use yourself unbeknownst to you, but now you're going to know about it because I'm pointing them out, or you'll have them used against you. Number 9, the appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance fallacy. What does this mean? This means claiming that something is true or false because no one can prove otherwise. That's the appeal to ignorance fallacy. So someone just making a statement and says no one can disprove your statement, then it must mean that whatever you said has to be true and it must be accepted. Nobody can push back against it. That is the appeal to ignorance fallacy. For example, let's say that since nobody can prove the aliens don't exist, aliens must exist. All right, that's the appeal to ignorance fallacy. You can't disprove it, then it means it must be true. Or making any claim about anything, and because no one can prove that you're wrong, that your claim must be accepted as true. First of all, let me tell you one reason why this is a fallacy. Any claim that anyone makes, you must prove the claim. All right, any claim that you want to state, it must be proven if you want it to be accepted. Whoever makes the claim, the burden of proof is on you to prove that what you said is true. Same way that if you are arrested or charged with a crime in the United States of America, the burden of proof is on the prosecution or the state or the government to prove that you are guilty. They have to prove their claim that you are guilty of a crime. If they fail to prove their claim beyond a reasonable doubt, then you are innocent. As the saying goes, you are innocent until proven guilty. So whenever you are charged with a crime in the United States of America, the burden of proof is on whoever is making the charge. And the charge is usually coming from the state, the local, the state, or the federal government. They have to prove that you're guilty. And if they fail to prove you're guilty, then you get to walk free, even if everyone in the world thinks you did it. All right, so think about O.J. Simpson. All right, a lot of people think he did it, but the government failed to prove that he was guilty. Therefore, he got found innocent. All right, that's the way it works. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim. Or any claim about anything. Again, most people do this when they believe nobody can disprove their claim, and then they push it over because a lot of people don't understand what I just explained, that the burden of proof is on the person making the statement. So it's not, since it's innocent until proven guilty, or we don't have to accept it until you prove that it is a real thing. It's not something is true until you prove that it's not true. All right, that's not the way it works. That's backwards. So again, this one has become even easier to push on people because we are inundated with information these days. Some of it accurate information, much of it not. And not all the information that you're hit with is credible nor valid. But at the same time, we don't have enough time to go and chase down every single thing that we are told. So at some point, we got to just say, okay, whatever this person said, they said, and I'll come around and get into the details of it if and when necessary. But right now, I don't really have the time or the space to do that. So you kind of just let people throw stuff out there until it's time to scrutinize it. All right, this is the failure of journalism and why it's tragic for citizens, because journalists used to do this work for us. A journalist's job is to take the objective facts of a situation, usually presented by a reporter, right, which you will see on the news. The journalist's job is to go deeper and to find out why the facts are the facts. Why did this objective thing happen? What's the reason behind it? And the journalist's job is to interpret the reality of what happened and help everybody else understand it. That's what a journalist used to do. Journalists don't do that anymore for a couple of reasons. Number one, they started competing against social media, and social media is not really about truth or facts or what is accurate. Social media is more for entertainment and just keep giving people dopamine hits. Anything is going to keep them scrolling. That's what social media is about. That is not what journalism is about fundamentally. Unfortunately, journalists started competing with social media, and because social media was so powerful and is so powerful, journalists started playing social media's game instead of social media playing journalists' game. And this is the reason why journalism doesn't exist anymore, because most of your favorite journalists are now more accurately described as influencers, because their job is just to give you things that will keep you pushing a button and keep you getting the dopamine hits on TikTok or Twitter or YouTube or Instagram, not to give you the objective reality, which is much less addiction forming. It is much less like candy. It is much more like vegetables. All right, which one do you think you can sell more of over the course of a day, vegetables or candy? Of course, you're going to sell more candy. Why? Because candy is the instant gratification, and because it is scientifically engineered to be addictive. Vegetables are not scientifically engineered to be addictive. They're made by Mother Nature. There's no scientific engineering behind it. But a Snickers bar, are they scientifically engineered? This is the reason why journalists have fell into this game, because they had to keep up. And on top of that, the companies that journalists work for they have to keep up too, because if they can't keep people clicking and subscribing and paying, well, everybody goes out of business. So I understand why it's happened. I'm also disappointed that it happened. All right, so whenever you hear me say journalism is dead, this is the reason why, what I just explained. And I may do another updated episode on the death of journalism, because journalism from all spaces is completely dead. Political journalism, everyday journalism, cultural journalism, sports journalism is all dead for the exact reason that I just laid out. That frame applies in all aspects. So these days, because we don't have anyone doing this work for us, interpreting what's true and what's not and helping us understand it, we have to figure it out on our own. But here's the problem. I just told you, human beings are fucking lazy. All right, people don't have the mental capacity or the mental desire to do the work to figure out what's true and what's not. Therefore, people just blindly accept anything that's told to them as long as it adheres to something that they want to believe, whether it is true or not. That's the problem, and that's why we have so many people with so many divergent views, even though we're looking at the exact same situation, because we don't have anyone objectively interpreting things these days. So whenever you hear someone say that it seems like people are much more divisive than they were back in the day, even 5-10 years ago, that's not because of any one person showing up or a political party or any of the bullshit things that people try to say as to why it's happening. It's happening because we don't have anyone giving us the objective truth anymore. It's left up to us to figure it out on our own. And most human beings are incapable of doing this because most human beings are too damn lazy to do the mental work. That's why it's happening. So this is how the bandwagon fallacy works. You get all these people with this opinion on this side, all the people with another opinion on the other side, and they just stand on each side. They're standing on their own sides, throwing rocks at each other across the divide between the two of them. That's what's happening. Did I just describe society pretty accurately? Yes, that's exactly what's happening. So all this said, this is why failure of journalism hurts us. Makes it easier to be deceived by things that are simply not true. And it's easier for anyone to undermine the validity of something that is true. So you don't know when the bullshit is bullshit, and you can't even tell when the truth is the truth. You have to think for yourself these days, again, which is work. This is why we're in an information war. I explained this whole concept of an information war. That was, excuse me, episode number, that was episode number, trying to remember what I titled it, episode number 3032. We are at war. One of the reasons we're at war these days is because we cannot agree on what is true and what is not. And people are throwing out facts without understanding that facts can be used to deceive. You can deceive people with a fact. You can lie with a fact. Where you lie with a fact is by giving people the facts that adhere to what point you want to make, and you ignore the facts that don't adhere to that point. So by leaving those other facts out, you're doing what we call a lie by omission. And this is the reason why I tell you all politicians lie, because that's what they do literally for a living. That's all they do is tell you the facts that make them look good and ignore the facts that don't. All that said, let's recap today's class, which is part number 3 of our ongoing series, most common logical fallacies you'll come across. Number 7 is the red herring. This is when someone changes the subject and brings up a topic that has nothing to do with the main point that is being discussed in order to throw you off the scent and basically change the topic, because usually they don't want to talk about whatever is being focused on. Number 8 is the bandwagon fallacy. All of us think this, which means you must think it. All right, this is a foolish way of thinking. Actually, it's not thinking at all. There's a foolish way of following, and many humans are susceptible to this, so be careful of this. Number 9, appeal to ignorance. This is claiming that something is true or false simply because no one can prove otherwise. That is not how it works. The burden of proof is on the person who is making the claim, and if someone cannot prove a claim, then it is not accepted as true until or unless they can prove it. It is not the burden on you to disprove it. It's their burden to prove it. All that said, tomorrow we're going to go into the last of this 4-part mini-series of the most common logical fallacies. When you are ready to take your game to the next level, I'm assuming that somebody listening to this who wants to take their game to the next level, and you're serious about it, and you're serious about having me as your direct help in the process, go to workonyourgameuniversity.com. Work on your game. Dre, all